Thank you for waiting. All right. So today we are doing the Antebellum Westward expansion. And there's a lot in number one as far as information on the Mexican-American War and the Mexico's loss of Texas in 1836 and the loss of the far west, including California in 48, actually, 12 years later. All right. So this is what we want to open it up to. And on this one, I do a very basic revision is on number one, you often do conflict history, right? And you often do great man history. You focus on politicians who were expansionists and wanted that land. You do you do the narrative on how America became a giant and became able to gobble up this land from Mexico. And you treat the Mexican nation and leaders and others as victims. And, it's hard not to. But with this, my slight revision is instead of doing great man history, I say, well, what about the entire generation? Okay. As you may recall, remember at the time of Andrew Jackson, there was a great surge in political participation. You saw that one stat that I showed you last week, how those eligible voters as citizens who showed up to vote in 1824 was about 24%. And then by 1840, eligible voters were 80% voting by the election of 1840. So a huge upsurge, right? And we talked about the political culture. Remember we mentioned Alexis de Tocqueville and him coming to America and saying that all Americans expected to become kings. They were kind of insatiable with their desire for westward expansion and land. He said, remember that they would not even finish roofing their home, and they were already unsatisfied or dissatisfied with it and wanted something bigger and better and moved on. You also we also mentioned the log cabin campaigns, whereby the different politicians had to cater to the tastes of their voters, and they tried to describe their background as being just as humble as any American's background. That they grew up in a log cabin in extreme poverty and fought off grizzly bears in the frontier of Kentucky or Tennessee. And so that's how Andrew Jackson, had, as Hofstadter says, political offices fall to him like ripe fruit because he was that perfect guy, that rags to riches guy, that poor, humble frontiersman, that image and everything in background. So at any rate, this is about the same time still in the 1830s, the Jacksonian era. And you see this quote from right off the bat from John Quincy Adams. And John Quincy Adams today is depicted as a guy that was he was ahead of his time. It was unfortunate that this type of log cabin culture caught up with him because he fell victim to it. He was cosmopolitan. He was educated in Europe. His dad, right, was a founding father. And, and never mind the fact that he was also an abolitionist against slavery and so forth. He was very progressive and cosmopolitan. And that didn't bode well for him with the voters. They wanted someone like themselves. Okay. And so he definitely hit the target of putting on airs as if he were better than his contemporaries. So he was and there was more to it than that, but that was one of the reasons for which he became a one-term president like his father. And so he bemoans this fact here. He says that Americans, right, had a vicious cycle of racial intolerance and lust for others' lands. Elected politicians were fanning the flames of racism among their constituents, using people of other ethnic extractions as an other against which white Americans could feel a sense of unity. So it starts off kind of in the same mantra as most books, that it's these manipulative political leaders. They're like demagogues, right? They're using populism, the ugly side of democracy, appealing to people's base sentiments and their base emotions, their ignorance and their passions, right, to get their vote. But you look here and stuff, and then I kind of take a turn. I say, well, first of all, yes, you have politicians for sure, elected politicians who said some awful stuff, and especially when you have senators, because senators were not directly elected by the population, by the citizenry just yet, right? Not until the 17th Amendment in like 1916. And so at any rate, they're a step away from being elected, and they're supposed to be like the cream of the crop. And you have Charles Benton. Actually, he was governor of New Mexico, but I know there are others here that were senators. Edward Hannigan was a senator, and so forth. Look what they say. The Mexican character is made up of stupidity, obstinacy, which is stubbornness, ignorance, duplicity, and vanity. In no reasonable period could or should we amalgamate or integrate with the Mexican population. Okay. So, okay, yeah, same old, right? But look here, you have newspapers, other primary sources, the Cosmopolitan New York Herald depicted Mexican people as imbeciles, degraded by miscegenation, right, which is interethnic sex, and therefore unable to resist the advances of superior Anglo-Saxon Americans. Okay, so you have newspaper editors doing the same thing. Okay, but then I say, look at the average people. Look at the average people and how they fought. The ruthless manner by which Anglos fought Mexicans. And so, oh my goodness, General Zachary Taylor, um, let's see here. No, it's actually Winfield Scott, complained to Washington, D.C. regarding American war crimes against Mexicans that would make heaven weep, like raping Mexican women in the sight of tied up Mexican men. Right. And after that, the violence that incurred uh, that was incurred by the gold rush. A lot of Chileans and Mexicans were physically attacked during the gold rush, especially early on. Okay, let's see here. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. We're moving forward here. This is at the end of the war, and it's supposed to guarantee citizenship and property rights to Mexican Americans for whom the border crossed them, right? As now they're under the U.S. flag, while they had been under Mexico's, living in the same patch of land. It says here that let's see here, intimidation, extortion, outright violence by Anglo settlers against Hispanic Americans became commonplace in many regions lost to Mexico in the Mexican-American War. Anglo squatters or trespassers laying claim to land that they could inhabit and cultivate, burned crops, shot stray cattle, chased off vaqueros or cowboys, tore down or occupied outlying buildings, and blocked gates. The Arizona Hispanic town of Cieneguilla reported a priest tortured and murdered and women raped by Anglo invaders heading to the gold rush. The alcalde mayor is like a mayor of Santa Cruz, was held at knife point. Rumors spread of defiant Mexican bandidos engaging in retributive crime sprees, like the famous Juan Cheno Cortina, and of course Joaquin Murrieta, who they named Zorro after, in defiance, right, in an extra legal manner. The authorities quickly reverted to violent, vigilante, hypocritical justice. Okay, so then I moved back to the story of Texas. And what I'm trying to do is, if you let me fast forward past this story of Texas, is look here with, where is it? I wanted to get to the part about some of the, I think it's right here. If Santa Anna's archaic constitution, let's see here, I don't want to talk about that just yet. According to historian Robert Mary, American politicians in the mid-1840s recognized and presidential election results clearly proved that annexation of Mexican soil was popularly embraced. The Alabama Monitor printed a warning to presidential hopeful Henry Clay that his opposition to taking Texas could cost him the presidency, as most Americans wanted such. In return, Henry Clay issued his second Alabama letter, in which he avowed he would change his stance and simply be guided by public opinion. Future President James Polk was approached several times by fellow Southerners like Francis Perkins, who came and was sent by John C. Calhoun, who even threatened secession, right, if he, Polk, did not support annexation of Mexican territory. Granted, Polk already leaned in that direction personally. Nevertheless, that such pressure was applied to him suggests that Southerners of his generation deserve blame for American imperialism along with him. But not just Southerners. According to historian Mary, news reports and local political analyses suggest widespread support for annexation in Pennsylvania, New England, Indiana, Illinois, and elsewhere in the North. When Polk won the presidency on such an expansionist platform, he failed to put into his cabinet Northern Democrats who helped him win, placing Southern warhawks instead. The stage was set. So my point being, right, is the common people were just as much to blame of that generation. They were applying pressure onto their elected reps. They coveted this Mexican land. It's not as if these elected reps are just acting independently, right? They were being reelected time and time again on these platforms. And it's not as if they hid their agenda as they were running for office. They made it clear in their platform, I want California. If I have to go to war with Mexico for California, I will do it. That was Polk. And Polk was elected president, right? It's not like he engaged in some kind of coup and just violently took over. He was elected, okay? So at any rate, then you get into Texas, and it's just you have there was defiance from the very get-go, okay? The gringos that were allowed, or Norte Americanos as they were called, who were allowed into eastern Texas under the impresario Stephen Austin, who he and his father, Moses Austin, were trusted by Mexican authorities to be kind of a go-between between them and their Anglo settlers and the Mexican government. They were to receive, 4,438 acres of free land. They were to be tax exempt for, at least 2 years? At least 2 years. I have it in here somewhere. Okay. They had it made. And all they had to do was abide by Mexican law and learn the Spanish language and become Roman Catholic. Well, Stephen Austin did. And there were at least 2 rebellions in his area. And he not only even reported ahead of time when he sensed something was brewing, but he also literally fought against them militarily to keep them from succeeding. So hence up to a certain point, Stephen Austin, chronologically, Stephen Austin was loyal to the Mexican government that put him there as the impresario. The more famous of the two, you had the Turtle Bayou resolutions and also the Fredonian Revolt. And he opposed both of them, okay? But then what happens is you have Mier y Terán, who comes up on an expedition to check out how things are going. Okay, you see his name right here in red. Mier y Terán comes back with bad news. He tells Mexico, first of all, the gringos are outnumbering the Tejanos, the ethnic Mexican Texans, 10-1. He said they are haughty and defiant, right? So haughty is like they're arrogant and they don't feel like the rules apply to them, and they're defiant. They defy what is expected of them. You had a guy at Anahuac who was supposed to be the tax collector amongst the Norte Americanos, and Juan Bradford Davis. And he was John Bradford Davis, and he assimilated. And they attacked him, and they attacked his trading post when he tried to collect taxes from them. So that was reported as well. And so at any rate, it comes back down to Bustamante, the president at the time of Mexico. and he has Congress pass the April 6th colonization law of 1830. And in it, they responded that Mexican colonists were to be sent up to live in eastern Texas to help with the big disparity in populations. No more Norte Americano immigration for the time being. And then any of those who are defying Mexican law are to be deported out of eastern Texas. So this caused a big wave of complaints from several cabildos or city councils that were manned by Norte Americanos, by Americans or gringos. And so Stephen Austin thinks that he could come and be the middleman. And he went down to Mexico to complain about the, or not even really complain. Matter of fact, in his stance initially, he contended that the April 6th law was perfectly rational, but he wanted to warn the president, who is now a new president, it was Gomez Farias of Mexico, that if he didn't at least give in a little bit, let's say particularly on them allowing them to keep their slaves, because they were in defiance of Mexican law. Mexico had banned slavery in its Constitution of 1824, and subsequently finished it off in the 1830s. And so at any rate, he said, if you don't at least allow them to keep their slaves, at least for a time being, or compensate them for their slaves, you're going to have a rebellion on your hand. So Gomez Farias, supposedly there was a little bit of an ego clash, and Gomez Farias had Stephen Austin arrested and put into a small jail cell for about 14 months. When he was in there about a year, Stephen Austin snuck out a letter to the city council of San Antonio saying, I no longer am going to try to hold back the rebels. He said, I can't reason with the Mexican government. Do what you will. Do what you wish. So now at this point, he's no longer loyal to Mexico. And so there's another coup. It was called a holy coup because Gomez Farias went after the Catholic Church. And Santa Anna, in the name of conservative forces and those for the powers and the ancient privileges of the Catholic Church, overthrew Gomez Farias to take over. But what he does is he issues one of two very conservative constitutions. Okay, so first of all, it allows him to shut down Congress at will. Okay, that's kind of a scary thing. The executive could shut down the legislative of the nation. He is to handpick governors instead of the governors being elected by the constituents of their states, as had been the case. He could also do away with state legislators. And so to a large degree, this did do away with representative or elective government and local power and local government as well, compared to the liberal Constitution of 1824. So this is all the gringos need, right, to rebel. And it was that the Siete Leyes, the 7 laws Constitution. So they do. And of course, about 200 of them stay at the Alamo in San Antonio and are killed about the 6th of March in 1836. And then they became martyrs in the public eye. But notice what William Baird Travis sent out. He said, liberty-loving Anglos, come and join the righteous fight against a mongrel Spanish, Indian, and Negro race. So notice, if they were supposed to just be fighting an uber conservative in a simply political battle between those who want more democratic and more localized power, right, versus centralists like Santa Anna, why would they bring up mongrel Spanish, Indian, and Negro race? Liberty-loving Anglos. Okay, so William Baird Travis, he kind of demonstrates the ethnic part to this, the nationalistic part to it that was always there. Okay, in fact, you had two two leaders of the rebellion who were Tejanos, okay, and they were father and son. They were Juan and Erasmo Seguin, Seguin. And the Seguin family, after independence, did not stay long, and they moved back down to present Mexican territory because of the racism, the racial discrimination that they faced trying to live up here. So they tried to tell themselves at the beginning of this rebellion that this is not ethnic, this is not nationalistic, this is political, this is philosophical. We are liberals, we are Democrats, and we're fighting against a conservative, tyrannical ruler in Santa Ana. But it doesn't seem that way. Okay. And of course, Davy Crockett and James Bowie and others died at the Alamo as well. And they became, like I said, like martyrs in the US. Well, what ends up happening is the American forces, they attacked when, ironically, when the Mexican army was at its strongest. They were following the art of war with Sun Tzu. He said sometimes it's ironically good to fight someone when they know they're strong because they put their guard down, because they think that they're impregnable and they can't be attacked. And that's pretty much what happened at San Jacinto, Jacinto. At the San Jacinto River, Santa Anna had his army put into three groups for quite some time to be more mobile. And they met up, the three groups, at San Jacinto. And that evening, in the early hours before dawn, the American army under Sam Houston attacked them. And they did not expect it. They did not expect to be attacked for that very reason. They thought they were kind of impregnable, being all three groups put together in such numbers. And it worked out for Sam Houston's men, and they captured Santa Ana, put him under that famous tree, and offered him either his life or Texas. And he signed Texas over. So Texas is signed over at the end of the summer of 1836. And from 1836 through 1844, for the next 8 years, it's going to be its own independent, quote, Lone Star Republic, right? Its own country. But the Mexican president and Congress made it clear that they plan to re-annex Texas. And if the United States were to decide to try to annex Texas as a new state, it would be tantamount to a declaration of war. Okay. So at any rate, 12 years later, you have, 8 years later, toward the end of 44, you had a president who was on his way out. The only president, I believe, who was actually kicked out by his own party, and that's John Tyler. John Tyler had nothing to lose. He was on his way out. He'd already been lost for re-election. And he, for whatever reason, I've never read a bio on him, actually, and shame on me. But he just was, his Southern roots really came out. And he did everything with the Democratic Party, for slavery, for annexation of territory for the voters, etc. All the vices of the Democratic Party at that time. But he was a Whig, and the Whigs kicked him out. So at any rate, his last gesture is he asked Congress to annex Texas. So then he gets out of office, and in comes Polk. And Polk is just as gutsy as he was. Polk said that he wanted California, and he said he promised he would only run for one term because that's all he wanted to do as president. And he was true to his word in that sense. So at any rate, Polk comes in, and he does not erase what Tyler had done. He runs with it, and he too asked Congress to annex Texas. Okay, so at that same time, we sent one and then a second diplomat we sent a guy named Poinsett, that poinsettia flowers are named after, and another gentleman, I can't remember his name, but we sent two gentlemen, one after the other, to ask Mexico to sell California to us. And on both occasions, they were dealt with very shortly because they were the Mexican government and politicians were affronted. It was an offense to their honor that we would even have the gall to ask that for them to sell California. So, needless to say, in both occasions, they were sent back and told no way. But when they tried both of those, then Polk decides to, according to Chicano historians, pick a fight. And so he fights over the southern border of Texas, as we were thinking about, annexing it. And he contends that it goes down to the Rio Bravo del Norte, or the Rio Grande. And according to some Spanish sources and maps, it only went down to the Nueces. And then underneath the Nueces, it belonged to Mexico. And so we sent men beyond the Nueces to the shores of the Bravo del Norte, to the Rio Grande. And so already, according to Mexican sources and Spanish maps, we're in Mexican territory. But we're contending that we're not, right? Because we're staying on our side of the Rio Grande. And so they stayed there for a couple weeks. And then there was a, I can't remember the euphemism they used, but it was like they were going to go on a reconnaissance tour, some of our cavalrymen. And when they did, a scuffle ensued, and about 17 of our boys were shot and killed off their horses. So Polk goes to Congress, says American blood has been shed on American soil, which is arguable, and Congress declares war against Mexico. All right. So at any rate, when you see this, like I said, I'm contending that entire society, the entire American generation, was to blame for this. Now, I make it clear here at the end, there's always a loud numerical minority, okay? So according to historian Ronald Walters, the Pacific movement possessed a common Christian foundation that may have assisted its adherents to staying united. Nevertheless, they split and weakened the movement for multiple reasons. For instance, mainstream Protestant denominations and Quakers, who both were opposed to the war, seemed to mutually refuse to cooperate. Reverend Beckworth alienated some followers when he stated that while the Mexican-American War was immoral, some wars were not. And they're talking about just war doctrine that comes from the Catholic Church. That's for another day, but that's a really cool subject. And I talk about other movements of Christians that splintered from one another, and it weakened their efficacy in opposing the war. But the intellectuals and the antebellum reformers, the abolitionists, and the evangelicals, and not to mention the Roman Catholics, especially fighting a Roman Catholic Mexican country, all opposed this war, but they comprised evidently a numerical minority. So I'm blaming the whole generation. All right. Then with number 2, okay, Turner's thesis. Pretty simple thesis, all right? This Turner contends that the West reestablished meritocracy in this country. Remember, meritocracy is you get what you merit, what you earn, what you work for, what you deserve, okay? So, how is that? Well, he says the conditions in the West were such that both the dangers and the opportunities were indiscriminate. And that adjective is vital to his thesis, okay? Both the dangers and the opportunities in the West were indiscriminate. So the dangers, right? Getting one of a myriad of diseases at this time in the 1840s, okay, along the overland trails of the Oregon Trail, the Mormon Trail, and the Santa Fe Trail. Um, yeah, cholera, uh, typhoid fever. Um, uh, what's that awful one? Um, shoot. I can't believe I can't think of the horrible one. At any rate, it'll come to me. But they didn't play favorites, right? They didn't follow demographic trends, these illnesses, these pathogens. They would just randomly catch different people of different ethnicities, different ages, gender, socioeconomic background, etc. Okay. Um, then you also had the rivers, the treacherous rivers, the Columbia River, the Snake River, the Platte River. A lot of people drown in those rivers. Okay. Going along the Oregon Trail, the Crow, the Shoshone, and other tribes, the Nez Perce, they were known for attacking or blackmailing people that came across their territory. They would, point guns and arrows at you and make you give them what you have, or else they'd kill you on the spot. And so that sometimes happened. And supposedly they played no favorites. In the South, it was, of course, the Apache and the Comanche, the Navajo, etc., who were known to do just the same thing. So you had to worry about Native American attacks going through their territory. Okay. You also had the flora and fauna. You had poisonous flora that you're not familiar with that you think is edible, and then ends up taking you out. To bison and roaming cattle stampeding you. You have Candy Moulton, an old historian who'd have stats, somehow develop stats and like lists of names of people who were gored to death by cattle and bison, etc. It definitely happened. You had hypothermia. You had snow avalanches through the Sierra Nevada and through the Rockies. There's just plenty of stuff that could happen to you, right? As far as risks and dangers. Then, not to mention, you had areas and circumstances in the West in which that area at that given time experienced chaotic anarchy. And as you know, anarchy means no government, no leading institutions for law and order. So first of all, when they sent that famous uh, gold chip to the president from Sumter's place, he decided to do away or ignore the Northwest ordinances. And in the Northwest ordinances, you have the land survey office come by. You put everything in 6-acre square plots. You have so many of those constitute a city, so many of those constitute a county, so many of those constitute a state. You have a proper process by which you sell public lands to the public, either by auction or at a set price and first come, first serve. It's very methodical, okay, that the founding fathers set up. Well, he defied that. President Polk did. And he just told Americans to just go and trespass. Whatever they could find was theirs as far as gold. And he wasn't stupid. He had to have known this was going to be devastating, especially for Latinos, for Hispanics, who already owned that land. And now they have all these squatters coming onto their property, right? Coming from the east. So at any rate, when this happens, you literally have, mining towns. And then you will also have cattle towns that have no government. There's no sheriff. There's no elective sheriff yet. There's no police department, etc. Literally, it's anarchy. And so then you have vigilante groups that are established. And that's why you have to this day, in the memorable cities up 108 in the gold rush towns, you have infamous trees that were known as the hanging trees. That vigilante groups would hang people from, taking justice into their own hands. So, there was danger that came with that for sure. Okay. But the point of it is, though, right? There are a couple things. One is that the dangers were indiscriminate. Okay. They were faced by everyone. And so, hence, what they did is, secondly, is these dangers kind of weeded out the unlucky and the weak. Okay. The unlucky and the weak. And those who were adaptive enough, those who were smart enough, those who were tough enough, they made it through these, right? Regardless of their demographic, whether they're man, woman, Hispanic, Asian, anything, that's not supposed to matter at all. Uh, and so, what were some of the opportunities that were given in the West if you were quick enough, smart enough, etc., to take advantage of them? Well, for one, as I already kind of mentioned, was land. From the time of Andrew Jackson in the previous decade of the 1830s, now by the 1840s, they have very liberal squatters' rights. So that even if someone could prove that he owns certain property, but he's not improving that land by farming and cultivating it, you still have a chance of taking some of that land from him as a squatter and claiming that you're on it and that you're using it and that you're cultivating it. Okay. You also are going to have, by the 1860s, a Homestead Act during the Civil War. I know I'm jumping ahead now, but they will grant you 150 acres of free land as long as you stay on it for 10 years and do not sell it for at least 10 years and try to improve it and farm it, etc. And you claim loyalty to the federal government against the Confederacy and promise not to have slaves. So at any rate, so land was an opportunity. Another big opportunity was entrepreneurial. Remember, entrepreneur just means risk taker, I guess, in French. And it just means that you start a business of some sort. So entrepreneurial opportunities were there. So for instance, the Mormons, they began offering a ferry business to ferry people across the dangerous rivers and charging 40 cents a person. And they got rich just from that alone. It added up. Okay. You had people that would go in different directions and offer to take people's mail for them to the same direction that they wanted the mail to go to. But of course, demand a certain amount of cents on the dollar for taking that letter of a loved one's to that given town or that given post office. So if you were quick on your feet, you could find ways to make money. Then, of course, you have anywhere near a mining town, a cattle town, or anywhere where a train depot was, is all you had to do was consider a product or a service that was coveted, that was desired by the men in that area. So, for instance, they called it mining the miners. You go where the mining town was, and you don't bother mining for gold yourself. You trade them shovels. A guy named Sam Brannan got an almost monopoly up along the west coast of California in buying shovels and pickaxes, and then sold them at the prices he wanted to these desperate gold miners and became filthy rich. Okay. The Chinese did very well washing clothes and providing restaurants, and but mainly washing clothes was what they were mainly known for. And they made good money. It added up, charging per person. Okay. And then, of course, you had gambling houses and saloons and prostitute brothels and other places as well of entertainment where you could take that money right from the miners. Okay. And the same thing at cattle towns and the same thing near train depots. All right. So entrepreneurial opportunities were there. So at any rate, that's what Turner's thesis is he said that the West renewed American meritocracy. But on the East Coast, it wasn't always the case. That a lot of times it was like the first people who were there during the colonial period, those who had the best connections to the English at first, right? And other types of privileged positions that they were in that gave them a leg up against everybody else. That wasn't fair. But in the West, it opened the playing field to everybody, supposedly. That everyone was open and free to compete but it was tough, right? Nothing ventured, nothing gained. That you had to survive all of those quote indiscriminate dangers and take advantage of those indiscriminate opportunities, and that anybody can do it. Okay, so it renewed American meritocracy. Okay, so that is Turner's thesis, and it's a romantic one, right? Because it claims that we have an exceptional country, that our frontier region and that history in the mid 1800s make this country a country of equal opportunity for everybody. But if you know me, you know I'm not going to stay with that one, right? I'm going to challenge it. See here. So now with number 3, a glimpse into 19th century Anglo-Hispanic relations dispels the myth of Turner's thesis. Because see what happens to me is a perfect example is when you read Turner, it makes sense. It really does. It to me it did. But it's what he left out. It's what he conveniently omitted, right? And that's a powerful tool by historians, is just conveniently leaving out inconvenient data. So yes, the points that he made make sense. They absolutely do. But he conveniently did not mention these points, right? So for instance, Americans coveting Mexican California. Richard Henry Dana, he came, and this is a perfect example to me, is he said he loved Mexican California. He said it was so beautiful. It was so fun to enjoy and stay there. And the people were wonderful, he said, right? But then look what he says here. Imagine such land in the hands of a more enterprising people. So what he's saying, right, is that his love for Mexican California was kind of condescending, right? It was kind of condescending. He was like, "Oh, it's beautiful here, but all these Mexicans, they don't know what they're doing. They don't have common notions of enterprise, economic enterprise, right? They're not building mills or factories, and using machine-based production and so forth. So just imagine if we enterprising Anglo Americans took control of this beautiful land. Just imagine how wonderful we could make California." Okay. So at any rate, that kind of, you know what I mean? This is supposed to be a well-meaning man. But when he wrote this and he had it sold back in the States, he made it very clear that he was very kind of condescending toward Hispanics and saying that, you know, they're a warm, great people, but they're just not, they're kind of backward compared to us. Okay. So at any rate, let's see here. So the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was supposed to promise Mexican citizenship rights after the war, right? But plenty of things happened that did not happen with, okay? First of all, California and New Mexico, right away, excuse me. California and New Mexico passed laws, said that they were going to carry out the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and land transactions, not the federal government, and they were going to adjudicate, right, like referee disputes over land, and they were going to make the criteria. So you got to be worried right away. You should be worried if you're Hispanic as soon as they did that, trying to take it out of the country, the federal government's position, and put it into their own power. So what did they start doing? They made it difficult for Hispanics. They wanted latitude and longitude lines. Okay, and think about this: a lot of them, their grandfather and bisabuelos, their great grandfathers, received that land first that they were on from Spaniards before Mexico even came into being as an independent country in the 1820s. And so they have it under Spain. What are the odds of them having latitude and longitude lines on that piece of paper, or even them still having that piece of paper? And then the borders of the property have to be permanent. Well, sometimes you would think they're permanent, like with a big boulder, and then somehow that boulder had moved. Okay, and so they made it tough. for them to prove exactly how much land that they possessed. And then, like I said, also is that a lot of the Spaniards and Mexican owners after them, a lot of them were pastoral, so they had sheep and they had cattle, etc. And so, so they would have these rolling hills, and you don't see anything. You don't see, stalks of corn sticking up. You don't have neat rows of almond trees or anything like that. You have just this land over which the animals roam. And so, I think you know where I'm going with this is they're going to contend under old English law that they are not rightfully using the land. And then not to mention, they could start off by saying that they were under the miscalculation that it wasn't owned by anybody, right? When they just go to these rolling hills and they don't see really any a fence or anything, and they just squat on that land and they say, "Oh, I didn't know this was owned by Don, you know, uh, whoever it might be." So you had like the Nieto family, right? Like grandkid name. You had the Nietos, you had the Verdugos that owned land around Disneyland and down in Pasadena, and they had thousands of acres, and they had a lot of it carved up by this and that Anglo squatter that came in and said, "Well, there's no one cultivating the land on this portion of his property." And so then you get judges that come in. And from the 1830s and Andrew Jackson's period, the judges now are often elected. And see, that was one of the main things of the spirit of checks and balances by Montesquieu, is he said, you're supposed to handpick judges and let them stay there for life so they could make the unpopular decisions and protect the numerical minority without worried about how popular their decision is because they get to stay in office. That's the key to that. But now, right, by making them elected, they're catering to the majority. And the majority from 1848 to 1852, oh my goodness, what was it, 1849 alone? There were like 89,000 came across the Oregon Trail. So Anglos just greatly outnumbered the Hispanics. And so if you wanted to stay popular and get reelected as a judge, it was in your best interest to go along with the Anglo party and vote with them. And not to mention, judges are human beings who live in their time period. So some of them had prejudice against the Hispanics to begin with. Okay, so you have all this going on. Then you also have you had a case of a Mr. King, Richard King. This guy goes after the biggest Hispanic ranch in Texas, the Espiritu Santo, right? The Holy Spirit Ranch, it was called. And he keeps taking this guy, this I think it was like the Navarro family. He kept taking them to court, and the gentleman shows him the paper outside of court. And he says, "You know, I own this land." He says, why are you incessantly attacking me for my land? You know, I have the paperwork. I own this land." And Mr. King laughs and says, "Oh, I know you do." He says, "But I'm going to get you drowning in lawyer fees until you decide to sell it to me." So he knew exactly what he was doing. He knew that Espiritu Santo plantation was rightfully owned by this Hispanic family, but he also knew that they could not afford to repeatedly go back into court and pay their lawyers exorbitant fees until they would end up, getting in peril and in economic financial danger. So there were lots of ways like that. So some of the lawyers that were supposedly helping the Hispanics out were fraudulent and greedy and duplicitous, and so some of them lost their land to their lawyers. It was just one thing after another. A reason for which a lot of Hispanics lost much of their land, despite the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo contending that they are U.S. citizens entitled to the right to life, liberty, and property. Okay. So at any rate, and then of course you had the foreign miners taxes, right? And I should have them somewhere in here, But the foreign miners taxes were no joke. Okay. Let's see here. The California legislature enacted a foreign miners tax of $20 per month for non-citizens, aimed primarily against Hispanic and Asian miners. $20 a month back then was ridiculous, was ridiculously high. Okay. And so and they were angry. They were angry that the Chileans knew how to use mercury to discern between real and fool's gold, and had other tactics that they used that were very effective, and other people didn't know how to use. And so their success brought about envy and anger, right? The Mexicans from Sinaloa in the northern states, just beneath California, and Coahuila, just beneath Texas, they made it here before the Overland Trail guys. And as you see in the primary sources of the gold rush of 1848, those who got here first in 48, they did not need any capital. They didn't or any money to begin with. They didn't need any expensive equipment. They could literally take it out of the bottom of the rivers, of the Feather, the Cosumnes, the American River, etc. It was just there for the taking. So if you were here early, you got the best seat in the house. And some of them were Hispanics who got here early. And there was a lot of rage, saying, hey, we just won this from you in the Mexican-American War, fair and square. This is our gold, not yours, etc., etc. All right. So what ends up happening, sadly, is with Hispanics, is they end up being stuck or pigeonholed into the proletariat. People would not employ them in anything other than arduous physical manual labor that did not pay well and that did not have many opportunities for advancement going up the socioeconomic scale. And so a lot of them ended up working for big railroads, doing the grunt work from day to day, and working for the big mining companies, doing the grunt work for them. But it won't be until about the turn of the 1900s when they become identified as campesinos, as laborers out in the fields agriculturally. Actually, before that, in the 1800s, it was more likely to be Asians. They were called coolies, coolies, and it's kind of like a modern day form of indentured servitude. And they had it going on from Asia to Hawaii to California, etc. And they were under contract. And again, the Asians as well, they did not have any opportunities for advancement. They were not paid as well as Anglo-American workers would have been. And it's ironic, right? Because they developed such a good reputation for being diligent, efficient, and docile workers who did what they were told. Okay. And so with Hispanics, that's what happens is they're not only just actually in reality kind of confined to the proletariat, but they also culturally have been told that they're stereotyped that that's where they belong. That's what Hispanics are good at, is manual labor. That's what they need to remain doing, etc. And so they were pigeonholed into the proletariat. Now, how do they respond in turn? With Hispanics, they fought back both within the system and beyond the system. So, for instance, in New Mexico, they used their numbers very well as citizens, and they ran people for office, for political office, and they did pretty darn well of keeping people elected. A lot of mayors, state assemblymen, and others who were elected as Hispanic politicians. Okay. They also fought well with their businesses, like, for instance, San Antonio, Texas. What was another city? Tucson, Arizona, whereby you had like this small Hispanic middle class, white collar middle class of writers, educators, artists, musicians, etc. Now, granted, they oftentimes had the constituency of people buying their stuff, coming to their shows, or going to them and seeing them as the doctor, who were also fellow Hispanics, right? They kind of had to stay within their own ethnicity for their own constituency, but still, they developed white collar classes in some of these areas. And then, of course, beyond the system is you think of people like Joaquin Murrieta, that was named Zorro, right? Guys who said, you know what, I'm going to stick it to the man. I'm going to become a bandit, a bandido, and I'm going to steal from the Anglos and give to my people. And so I think a good example of a group that did both were the Gorras Blancas, Gorras. Gorra is a hat, and then Blanca is white, right? The white hats. Um, they they went to Anglo ranches and cut their barbed wire fence and let their cattle out to try to give some of the cattle back to the Hispanic people that they claimed the Anglo ranchers stole from. They did things like that were kind of extra legal, but they also ran people for office, and and people knew that they kind of had that double reputation as Gorras Blancas. They were kind of feared and respected. But yeah, they ran people for office, and they had quite a few politicians connected to their organization in New Mexico, in particular, and Texas. All right, and then of course, what Hispanics did very well is they held on to their culture very well. Okay, no matter how far down the socioeconomic ladder they became. And then with the Asians, and like I said, it was incredible the way that they were. I think I have it in the next one. It's incredible the way that they were exploited. Yeah, you have them right here, known as Orientals or Celestials. Okay, uh, historians believe approximately 1,200 Chinese laborers died building the Transcontinental Railroad. How awful is that? And so they that's what's ironic with the Chinese, right? Is their positive reputation for being effective, quick, efficient, diligent, right? Very thorough and hardworking laborers. That's what got them in trouble, is because they became known as the ideal laborer, and so people said that they are stealing our jobs. These Orientals are stealing our jobs. And so you had a famous bet with Charles Crocker of the Big Four of the Central Pacific Railroad, the part of the Transcontinental. And he made a bet that his 100 Chinese workers could build a mile of track in a day. And they did so easily. And it went all throughout the newspapers and so forth. And from then on, he started buying, to quote, borrow as indentured servants more and more until he got to about 14,000 Chinese laborers that he brought over. And they did very well. They suffered quite many things. Some were blown up in the explosions going through the Sierra Nevada. They had to chip holes in the granite rock, put sticks of dynamite while they're hanging from a reed basket, and hope that the reed basket is pulled up in time as it explodes. They died with snow cave-ins and avalanches, all kinds of things that could go wrong. Exhaustion, dehydration. And so, yeah. And so in 1882, there's going to be a Chinese Exclusion Act, and it's going to be led, ironically, by Irish American laborers who resented the Chinese taking their jobs. All right. So at any rate, number 3. So with number 2, right? Or was it? I'm sorry, with number 3 that we just did. Okay. We're saying we're arguing against Turner's thesis, saying Turner very conveniently ignored racial discrimination. Because remember, Turner was all about equality of opportunity in the West, right? Well, so much for equality of opportunity if they're treating Hispanics and Asians like that. Number 4 says, we don't buy this equality of opportunity because those who already had capital those who already had a bunch of money, always have a leg up over their competitors. In the West, just like anywhere else. So even in Turner's Frontier on the West, the wealthy, the frontier became the wealthy's playground. Okay. So for instance, okay, I remember like Howard Zinn. This is typical of like Howard Zinn and different Marxist conflict historians. Okay. So on this one, yes, it did say initially, right, that you could come here and estimated 30,000 to 50,000 worth of gold was extracted per day. But guess what? That time lapsed, right? And then in 49, 89,000 gold seekers crossed the Oregon Trail alone. Okay. There's only so much gold to be had, right? And now you have just thousands, like hundreds of thousands of people coming into California. Well, it doesn't take long. And guess what? Most of the mining mineral wealth was extracted hundreds of feet within the mines and the caves, etc. Well, good luck if you're an individual with a pickaxe trying to get 88 feet through granite stone with your pickaxe. So what happens? The corporations come in and they buy these pneumatic, which is air powered, and hydraulic, which is water powered, huge drills that are as big as an oil derrick, okay, that are like 5 stories high. And they just blast into the mountainside and extract most of what was left of the gold and the silver, etc. Okay, so who has that kind of capital to borrow or buy a machine like that? A wealthy corporation does, right? So at any rate, it says in reality, very few individuals struck it rich. Most of the wealth came from lode mining, hydraulic and pneumatic powered drilling. Right. And then we talked about the plight of the Asian laborers. Corporations like the giant railroad companies were parasitically enriching themselves off superior capital, federal subsidization, and exploitation of cheap labor. So that's another thing. Is remember going back to the days of Alexander Hamilton, is the federal government contended we want to diversify and become self-sufficient economically as a country, right? So they said, if someone is offering a service, right, that lends to that end, that helps diversify our economy or helps improve, trade from one region to another, etc., something that benefits the country supposedly, right? Then our federal government, starting with the very first administration of Washington's and Hamilton as his Secretary of Treasury, said, we will subsidize them. We will help them pay for their endeavors because supposedly what they're doing is best for the whole country. So look at this. The Central Pacific Railroad received 9 million acres of free land and $24 million in bonds. And you think the Central Pacific just sat on those 9 million acres? No way. They sold them at as high of a price as they could. So they got them for free and they sold them for every penny they could sell them for. Okay? Because supposedly them connecting the West Coast to the Midwest was benefiting the whole country. So therefore, the federal government was going to subsidize them in their endeavor. So you had the case of the Topeka, Kansas Railroad in Southern California. It came in and it had all these squatters at Muscle Slough. Okay. These poor squatters supposedly were dirt poor and they worked really hard to clear their lands, to begin cultivating them, to build cabins on them. And a local judge granted it to them, right? Well, in comes the Topeka, Kansas. And they said, sorry, guys, get out. our tracks are coming right through where you are. And they said, no, we're not leaving. We have a local judge telling us that this is ours by squatters' rights. And they said, well, we hate to one up you, but we have the federal Congress telling us that a mile on each side of the tracks belongs to us now. So the squatters refused to leave, and they brought in a deputy and a sheriff, and they shot at and even shot one of the two. And so then they went back to Congress, the Topeka, Kansas Railroad. Congress gave their permission for a regiment of soldiers all the way in Arizona to be brought up to Muscle Slough, Southern California, and to engage in a battle with these squatters to get them off that land and to give it to the railroad. And that's exactly what happened. So Muscle Slough is an example of revisionist history, right? That those with money, those with capital prevailed. Not just actual capital, right? Had more money to play with, but those who had political capital, who had connections to the federal government, right? Being subsidized by it, etc., that they had an advantage over the common people. Okay. And then many other ways, right? You have the Homestead Act, as I mentioned once, right? In 1862, 150 acres of free land. Corporations would use dummy names, dummy accounts, like hundreds of them, and get 150 acres from each dummy name and then put it all together under their corporation at the end. And they got away with it most of the time. They're trying to think of other ways that they would just do just kind of dirty stuff like that and get away with a lot. And then, of course, in the 1870s, barbed wire was invented, and that was a symbol of the rich man, is because they could squat on, and they could buy more land. They, under Rutherford B. Hayes, he declared all Spanish cattle in the West to be open and free for the taking, as long as they were not branded. Oftentimes they were already branded and people took them anyway. But at any rate, the rich ranchers could hire hundreds of vaqueros, of cowboys, to go and gather as many cattle as possible, put it on their huge allotment of land that they could afford to buy, and then surround it all with barbed wire. Okay. So they could just outdo everybody in every endeavor that they engaged in. So that's what this last number is doing, right? It's kind of conflict Marxist history. It's saying, I don't buy Turner's thesis. He conveniently omitted not only racial discrimination in his book, but he also conveniently omitted the manipulative power and the unfair connections enjoyed by corporations. And the advantage that gave those corporations over the common people. All right, so any questions?
I'm good, thank you.
No problem.
You know how you said they got free land and then they sold it all for the highest they could? Why did they get the land for free again?
Because, like I said, from the time of Hamilton, is they said, if your service is doing a service to the entire American economy, we're going to help you pay for the expenditures. It starts all the way with Hamilton at the very beginning of our country. So they would tell them, right? They would say, okay, every mile that you have to lay and track is going to be really expensive. So we will give you 16 acres of land on both sides of that mile for free to help you pay for it.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Okay, that was my question. Thank you.
No problem. No problem. Yeah, so you had it really well. You had it really well if you could convince the federal government that your economic endeavor was improving the entire country. Then to this day, I remember it wasn't that long ago, the federal government was offering subsidies to people that were doing something with Microsoft technology, and we were trying to keep up with the rest of the world. And I can't even remember where I read it, but the government pretty much is putting like an offer out that if you try to engage in this type of software innovation, the federal government is interested in helping you. Yeah, so they still do it. All right, so you guys feel okay? You feel okay on this assignment?
Yes.
Good. Good. I hope so. All right, and so that's it for me. If that's okay with you.
Great, thank you.
All right, thank you. You guys have a great week, okay?
Thank
You
you.
as well.
too.
Thanks.
Thank you.
No
You
problem.
too.
My pleasure. Take care.
You as well.
Bye-bye.
Bye.